The proof of claim submission form obviously has to be divided into two areas. There's an issue of set-off, and there's an issue of fundamental evidence. And one question that I'd put to John, and I want to quickly respond to a couple of Bob's points about privilege and things, but the reality of what we're dealing with now is we have industrial workers who have 3 or 4 decades of industrial exposure, and we know that they're sick. And what everyone knows, and we're all advocates, but we know what made them sick were these friable products that were banned 3 decades ago, manufactured by these companies that are now in bankruptcy. And if the purpose of a jury trial is to ascertain the truth, and you represent a family, and what you would like to do is come before the jury and say, my client was an industrial worker, and he's sick, and he had these 3 decades of exposure, the approach that you're suggesting eliminates the jury from hearing well over 99% of the truth about that individual claimant's exposure. And where I understand John's perspective, but where I'll disagree with him, he says that a lot of people who are trying cases want to come in and say, we were just a little guy. Well, the reality is these people want to defend themselves because they were little guys. In fact, they're not just little guys. We're trying cases now over 3 alleged gasket changes, when everyone in the room knows what made that individual sick. Is the amount of compensation in the trust sufficient? That's not my issue. We could debate what a fair amount is, but the reality is, instead of making this an overly burdensome and difficult concept, let's just simplify it. The issues in the case are, you represent plaintiffs, this group, very well. Okay? The issue is, what was their asbestos exposure, and can the plaintiffs demonstrate that this heavy machinery company that had 1 gasket in the machine made this plaintiff sick? Is this company responsible for making this plaintiff sick?
We're getting to that issue in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
We're going to come back to you. Let me get to the issue of double. Let me get to the issue of double dipping.
Judge,
okay?
I wasn't finished yet. No.
Okay. Well, no, because we're going to get to that after we wrap this up.
Let me.
Sure.
Maybe it's a simple trial approach, but my view and my client's view is we didn't make this plaintiff sick, and these are affidavits of exposure. This is sworn testimony. There couldn't possibly be anything more relevant to the jury to decide whatever the jury is going to decide. How could you preclude my client, who never made an asbestos-containing product in their corporate history, from coming in and saying, yes, the plaintiff's sick, it's very unfortunate he was exposed to all of these other products, he swore to it in an affidavit, and here's our product, and we'd like to defend it and have you decide whether or not we're responsible. And because there's such a high level of expertise in the plaintiff's bar, that's the last thing that we want to do. And if you go to these trials, you would actually think that Johns Manville never existed. Celotex never existed. There wasn't amphibole laced friable pipe insulation all over these plants, because the companies that were responsible for that are gone. So we're going to now, with these escalating values that we're going to talk about in a very short period of time, we're now going to take these sometimes very small companies, sometimes with very limited indemnity resources, and we're going to hold them responsible at 5 million, 10 million, 15 million a clip, when, if that's the way that the advocacy system works out, that's the way it will be. But in reality, in this forum, we can say if this actually occurred, changing 1 gasket didn't make this poor gentleman or woman sick. And so I think that there's, from my perspective, more of an evidentiary issue, and set-offs are set-offs, and we're going to have to deal with that. And just very quickly, just to legally respond to 2 of the arguments, to suggest that a claimant in a bankruptcy trust is an active participant in negotiations over the value of their claim is very difficult for me to support or understand. These are set values by the time these claimants sign their affidavits of exposure. They are not negotiating with the trust. They either get their 20% of 100 or they don't. They either meet the criteria or they don't. There's absolutely no active negotiations for an individual claimant, so I don't really think that that is a sustainable legal argument. And second, we all know the difference between work product. There is a privilege. Privileges are very rare, and they're matters of policy. And certainly, if these, I don't think any plaintiff's attorney is going to agree that their client's testimony is the result of their mental impressions or their work activity. These aren't notes that an attorney took from a meeting with a client. These are signed, sworn affidavits. This is testimony, and I think it's relevant in the underlying claims.